Hey everyone, and welcome to this video of essentially how do I organize and structure my backend server file so that it's nice, clean and tidy, organized and structured. So to help us do this, we are going to be using something that's baked into Express, built-in middleware called Express Router. Okay, similar to like React Router, but this is for the backend. In addition to that, we're also going to employ the MVC Model View Controller architecture to some extent, okay? Because that is a common architecture for organizing. When I say architecture, you can think of that as like structure or design pattern or way of doing the backend. Okay, so let's explore what I currently have in this backend server file here. So it's all pretty standard stuff. I've got some imports, some middlewares, a database config, and 3 endpoints. Okay, so the first endpoint is, well, all 3 are listing for GET requests. Okay, so this API/users, when it's triggered, we are making a request to the database. Just a simple select all from the teammate table. That's just the name of the table that I have set up in my database that I've connected in my env file. And then we're just returning that data to the front end ultimately. Okay. So after that, we have the authentication routes here. Now, the authentication route here has this login endpoint and also a sign up endpoint. Okay, they're sharing the same path here. And all we're doing is just sending back some dummy data here. So there's nothing really going on functionally because that would involve a little bit more setup in terms of creating a SQL query, and it's not the point of today. Now do keep in mind that I'm using app.get just for illustration purposes. If you were doing true authentication, you would definitely be using post. Okay, and then we're just listening at the bottom. So ultimately, why do we really want to structure our backend server file differently? What's wrong with this? Well, right now our file is small, but as our file grows, as our web application grows, it's likely that we'll add more endpoints. It's not uncommon to have tens upon tens or even hundreds of endpoints. And if it's all in one file, it's going to be very hard to manage very quickly. So that is the motivation for creating some kind of organized structure. So let's jump into it. First thing we're going to do is set up, well, some routes. We are going to create a folder called routes here. And inside of it, we're going to have, well, a users route and a authentication route for our authentication endpoints. Okay, so let's start by going user routes.js. Awesome. Okay, and inside of here, well, we're going to be using Express inside of here, Express Router specifically. So let's import Express as per usual. Require and Express. This time though, we're not going to be using a variable called app from Express, but router, right? And I'm going to call this variable, well, router. And it's from express.router with a capital R. Okay, and in here, we will have our users endpoint. So unlike previously where we have done something like app and then .get, this time it's going to be router.get. And now we essentially are just going to replicate what we currently have in our server file. So in other words, I'm going to have my path, my actual route, which is /API/users, and then our callback function, request and response as the parameters. Okay, and then our callback functions body here. Okay, next, I'm just going to literally copy what I currently have inside of my route on the user's route in the server file. So let me cut that, and I'm going to paste it just in there. Perfect. Okay. So now we've set up our first route, which is awesome. So again, we've really just shifted it to a separate file. And again, this is the idea, to separate out components, parts of our Express app. So it's more so that our application is more modular, ultimately. But in addition to this, I also have to export my router. I have to make my server aware of it, my server file aware of this router. And just like I would export a function or anything else, I can go module.export, and I'm going to set it equal to router. Awesome. Okay, and that's our user routes file for now. Next thing, let's actually then import that into our server. So underneath my database config, I think this is going to be a good spot for it. I'm just going to import my routes like I would any other module or file that I'm importing. So I'm going to import it as user router, and well, it is equal to, well, I'm finding it, requiring it from, well, the routes folder, and then user routes. There we go. Okay. After, and I might just give this a name here, route imports. Perfect. Okay. Then the next thing is to, well, use the router. Say we're importing it, which is one thing, but then we need to use it. So just like we have done with other middlewares above, app.use, and then user router. But I might even add another little title here, routes, just to really separate these out a little bit more. Okay, and I can actually get rid of this for now. Well, not for now, but altogether. Okay, so we've done our first step of separating things out, which is great. Now let me just go to the browser and just see if this is still working. Okay, so let me pull open this tab here. Okay, and let's go to, let's go to localhost port 4000/API/students, and well, cannot get, that's because it's not students, it's users. Okay, and I get another error here saying pool is not defined. Ah, well, that's true, isn't it? Here is our pool, but actually where we've defined it, but it's actually in here where we are using it, isn't it? Pool.query, and I wasn't even using it in my other two endpoints back in server, and the server file. So how do I make this globally accessible? Well, all I need to do actually is, well, I just need to say, instead of const here, I'm instead going to go module.exports. Ah, our favorite friend again. And this time, I'm just going to add it in this fashion here. Okay. Perfect. Now, this is fine, and this will work. Let's see, just to make sure. Well, actually, before I demonstrate to you, I'm going to improve this slightly, a little bit more, because this is something we can also move into its own folder and ultimately its own file, just again to separate things out a little bit. What do I mean? Well, I'm going to go ahead and create another folder now called, well, DB perhaps. And inside of here, a file called db config. Okay. Again, we're just separating out concerns where it makes sense. So I'm going to cut that, paste it in here, and also grab the import of MySQL and paste it up there. Okay, great. And that's all for now. I'm going to close that. Now if I go back to my user routes file, here I'm using pull, I just need to then import it. So I'm going to specifically grab the pull variable here, and I'm going to do that by directly deconstructing it from and actually I'm going to have to go up here to get into the parent directory, db config. Okay. My alternative to just structuring it here, well, I could do something like that, but then I would have to drill into my pull variable, pull.pull or something like that. Or I could call it dbconfig, db, then db.pull. But I think just structuring it is the cleanest solution. Okay, now let's go back and check the browser now and refresh. Okay, perfect. So now that's working just like how I had before, well, before I started the video. So this is great. Now we can separate this out a little bit further, and I'm just going to continue with my users endpoint for now. So now we have in this endpoint essentially our callback function here, right? Now in terms of model view controller architecture, what is the first thing that perhaps we can set up? Well, the easiest thing to set up would be the controller, because the controller is essentially whatever is being executed inside of the endpoint here uses. In other words, it's this callback function. However, it only becomes controller when we separate out this into its own file, okay? And then we'll call that file a controller. You might think of it as like a route handler, a handler for handling this this route, but indeed it is known as a controller. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a new folder here called controllers, and again it's just going to contain this logic, this callback function, but it's going to be separated out. And I put that in the wrong place. Let me just drag that out up here. There we go. Okay, controllers. So let me create a file then called user controller.js. Okay. Now the user controller is just going to be, well, back in user routes. I'm going to cut that whole callback function. We'll come back to that in a sec, but I'm just going to paste it inside of my user controller file. Now when I do put it in here, I do have to give it a name. I do have to name it something. So because in order to reference it here in the user routes, I have to specify like a function name, right? So let me call this function, because before it was a callback function, it was anonymous, but now I have to define it, and I'm going to call it get all users. Okay. And here, yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So I've turned it into a function now called get all users. I just need to pass this function in as the second parameter, sorry, the second argument for our get method. So how do I do that? Well, we're going to use our module.exports once again. Okay. Now, I always have the choice of how I add something to it. I can do something like this, like how we did with the server file, or because this controller file might have more than one function, I'm actually going to do it slightly differently and put this I'm going to put this function inside of the exports object like this. Well, yes, I've converted the equal sign to a colon, because essentially this get users is just a property on the exports object. Okay. Now, bearing in mind, I'm able to do it in this way. Like, remember, this is an arrow function here, so I'm missing the function keyword. So there's nothing different going on here. Okay. So now I have made this get all users function accessible. Well, I then just need to import it. So I'm going to call it user controller just to match the name of the file. Require that from, I'm going to go up one, controllers and user controller. And then as the second argument, well, now I can call user controller, and then the name of the method, which was get all users. Okay. Now I can see that the pool variable has gone dim, and that's indeed because I'm no longer using it in that file. It should be here. So I'm going to cut and paste that into users controller. Okay, great. Now we have created a controller. Okay, which in essence and practicality, we've just separated out another aspect of our endpoint. Ultimately, that's what we've done. Okay, so let's just see if we're still working. Let me go refresh here. Perfect. Okay, still getting our data, which is awesome. So that's working. Now, you may decide actually, and this is okay if you stop here. So the next part of what I'm going to show you is implementing a models folder. Okay, but the reason I say we can stop here is because it's not absolutely necessary. I would say it is good practice to have a controllers folder. Yep. But whether you have the model folder, up to you. I'll show you how we can use it though anyway. We're not going to be using the view folder. We're not going to create a folder called views because, well, we're not sending back any HTML. This is not a server-side rendered app. We're just sending back JSON data. So I don't have a view to send back. So being an MVC doesn't necessarily, there's not a hard and fast set of rules per se. It can be implemented with some flexibility. But I will implement the models part of the architecture. So how might that look? Let me go and create a new folder called models. Now models is literally concerned about just accessing the database. So controllers, there we go. Oh yeah, so controllers, all the controller is concerned about is making that query, like calling the function that makes that query, sorry. But the controllers file shouldn't actually make the query itself. We're going to separate out this piece of logic, this piece of code, into its own file. Because I'm going to cut that, as a matter of fact. And, well, create a new file in models, and I'm going to call it, well, user model.js. And inside here, well, I'm going to do almost the same thing as before. So let me start by just creating a new function, because I'm going to have to call that function in my controller. Now, I'm going to start it with query. Well, I'm going to call the function query all users. That describes what my query is going to do, or my function ultimately does. And I am just going to paste straight away my pull.query code. Okay, now again, I want to make this function accessible elsewhere, so I'm going to add it into, well, the exports object, like so. Okay, and just convert my equals to an object, to a colon, because now it's essentially a property on this object. Okay, awesome. And now I perhaps am kind of done. Yep, we've kind of just repeated the same process as before, just separating out a part of our endpoint, but I have to import it now into my user controller. But before I do that, let me just quickly grab the database line, because that is missing now, because that is now in the model file. Okay, great. So coming back to my controller. Okay, so now I just need to call this function, isn't it? The function user models query all user function, this one. So how do I do that? My controller is always going to send back to the front end, or wherever the request came from, whatever was pulled from the database, wasn't it? So just to complete my little controller code there. So we'll come back and finish this part here in a sec. But let's start by calling the function and see where we get on. So the name of my function was query all users, with an S, query all users. Okay, so let's get access to that function by, in my user controller file, going to store into a variable called user my model, which is up1 models user model. Okay, now I'm just going to reference user dot query all users. Okay, and let's see what happens. Let's just review our user model, the query all users function in particular, just to see what it's actually doing. So right now, this query is sending back the result and status, but that is not the model's purpose. The model is not supposed to send back data to the front end. That is the controller's job. It's just how the architecture works. So I don't want to send this information back, but I do want to return it to pass it up to my controller file. So how do I do that? Well, let's start by getting rid of this line here. Because again, I don't want to res.send. Okay. I ultimately want to return this result instead. So let me just try that and see what happens. What's going to happen if I run this code? Return result. What does return do again? That's the question. Let's see. Let me refresh. Okay, something went wrong there. Let me open up my terminal. Okay, well, let's console log the function call here, because again, I'm returning in the other function. So perhaps in my mind, I'm thinking that I should get this value here. So let's just see what that looks like. We'll try again. Refresh. Okay, I get undefined. Why is that? Let's have a look. So query all users. Okay, so we are returning result, yes, but we're returning it here. Okay, as in like, currently I'm not actually returning it into anything. I have to return it in something. So maybe maybe just to keep it simple, let's create a variable here called result. Okay, and in theory, whatever the database returns, it's going to get stored into this variable called result. So let me return this result variable, this one here. Let's see if that works. Refresh. Okay, and I get some kind of error here, don't I? What is going on? Well, ultimately, it's just not how pull works. It doesn't return a value. Okay, it gives us access to the value with this result parameter here, but I can't return it. It doesn't. It's not set up that way. So what can I do? Well, my first port of call might be to go and read the docs on the MySQL 2 package, and I will do that. So let's go. Let's just scroll down to something we can see. Okay, so I've already had a read of this, and our issue is that by default, indeed, pull.query doesn't return anything. The way we ought to use it is to do something with the result right away. In other words, I could console log it, and that would work here. Let me turn off the console log here. And let's refresh and go back to the terminal. Okay, awesome. So I can see I'm getting results here, right? So I somehow need to get these results from this result to, well, to return it to the parent function here, query all users. So how can I do that? Well, the best way to do that is to actually use a promise. Now, bearing in mind, when it comes to promises, we have two ways of writing promise syntax. One is by using .then method, and one is using the async and await syntax. Both achieve the exact same thing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is something like this. Okay, I'm going to get my pool, and I'm going to turn my query into a promise-based query. So instead of just accessing the result variable, now it will actually return something for me. Okay. So let me actually start by copying this example. I'll keep the catch as well at the end. Let's keep that. Okay. And so in my model here, instead of console log, in fact, instead of this whole line here for now, up to here, or maybe up to here, almost up to pull, almost got it, there we go. Okay, now let me just put my query back to how it was, from teammate, and this really should be a callback function. It still works, but this is the norm. Okay. And okay, so now I've turned my query into a promise-based query just by adding the syntax here. Now it is slightly different. With a promise-based query, I don't have a callback function this time, but I have access to the then method now. So when the query resolves, well, then do something. And with the default syntax from MySQL 2 website, they have destructured the essentially result data. So what we call result, they've called rows. So I'm going to call this result so you can see it. Fields is additional metadata, which we also have access to in the normal non-promise based query method, but we don't really typically use that. We just want the result. So let's see if this works. Like it did before we move on. And there we go. Let's refresh, come back. Okay, all right, we're still getting the same output. That is working. In the terminal, we're getting the result data. But now I don't just want to return, I don't want to console log it, but I want to return it. Okay, so how do I return it? Well, return this result now. These two are linked together. And because that's all I'm doing, I can get rid of the return keyword and the curly brackets, and the arrow function will return under the hood for me. And where it's going to return to is, well, my result variable, which I defined earlier. So now return results should work. So let's go back to our user controller here, and let's, for starters, see if we can console log the data that we are returning from our user model. So let's log to the console this whole entire function call, query all users, and let's open up the browser, and let me hit refresh. Okay, nothing's coming through anymore. Let's just check our console. Okay. Well, our function, query all users, has now been turned into a promise. Okay. Query all users, well, this, because we are using the promise-based version of the MySQL 2 pull, well, this is going to return when it's ready, not right away. So if it's returning a promise, and if I ever see that in the console, that means I need to use either .then or async and await. I will use .then here, and I'm just going to say, well, when I get my result back, then do something with it. Okay, so here I will actually do res.send, and I shall send back the result along with a status code. Okay, and let's see if that works. Refresh. Okay, and it does. Awesome. Okay. So at this point, we have essentially separated out as much as we need. So we have our controller for user, which is just all it's concerned about is, well, when its endpoint is triggered, which again, when the user routes, this route is triggered, API/users, well, user controller.get all users is called that method. Let's have a look at that. Here it is here. It's a method on the exports object. User controller. So get all users. Well, all it is concerned about is just asking the model, the user model, to make a query. Okay, that's what it's doing here. The controller is saying, hey, please get all the users. And then, well, when we get a result back, we're going to send it back to wherever the request originally or originated from. But I might decide to do some other things. It totally depends on what I'm wanting to achieve here. But for example, I might just perform some other manipulation. So let me just add a comment here. Manipulate the queried data, or just send it straight back to the front end. Okay. So what we see here is that the controller didn't do the manipulation of the database itself. It didn't access, sorry, the database itself. It relied on the model to do that. When the controller gets a result back, well, then it might do something with that result. If we were a server-side rendered app, In other words, if we were sending fully created HTML pages, which would be stored in the view folder, well, then I might have some kind of code which would access that HTML file in the views folder, insert my JSON data into it dynamically, and it would serve that to the front end. The front end would display that exact page with all the dynamic data already inserted into it. In my example, all I'm going to do is send back that data, and I'm going to let the front end deal with that, rendering the results. I'm not going to care about that. But the point is, that's the extent of how we can make this work, how we can set up express routing, okay, whilst also employing to some extent the MVC, okay. Now we can even go further and break our app down into more abstract pieces, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. Okay, now I'm not going to do the remaining login endpoints here and sign-up endpoints for the authentication route essentially, but feel free to give that a go if you would like. Okay, thanks everyone, good luck.